Hello everyone, welcome to the second video about the Azure Search. In today's video we are going to be doing the first step of creating the resources. In this case we are going to be working with the data source, so we are going to take a look how to define the data source for a blob storage, how to define the properties and all the required code that is needed in order to be able to build a data source. So we are going to be doing this first step, so join me on this video. I hope you enjoy it. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do in order to build application, it will be to install the required NuGet packages to build our solution. So in order to achieve that, we are going to be using initially also the NuGet packages that are from the Azure portal in order to make a successful authentication using the Active Directory credentials. So let's get started with that part. So the first thing that we are going to be installing, it will be the Microsoft.extension.azure NuGet package. And this one is going to be the one that is going to allow us to inject clients pretty easily in our code and also to set up very easily the authentication schema. From there, we will install the Azure.identity NuGet package, which is the one that of course is going to give us the capacity to interact with the Azure directory pretty simple from our services. Now, since we are working with the API from the Azure document, we need to install the NuGet package azure.search.documents, which is going to provide all the clients or all the APIs that are required from the operational perspective. Okay, that's pretty simple. So now that we have everything set up, we can move ahead and start doing a basic setup of the clients that we need to inject into our code. So as always, we are going to be located on the program.cs, and we are going to be injecting the Azure clients that are required to interact with the Azure services, in this case for search. Remember that we spoke about having things like indexes and also clients for do search. So for all these operations, the Azure library that we just installed throughout the NuGet package provide different clients. So let's get started by piece according to the requirements that we have. So in order to create a data storage, we will need to use the Azure Indexer client. So let's do that basic setup initially. So as always, we need to interact using the Azure Builder solution. So let's use the builder.services. And in this case, we are going to be calling the Azure clients again and provide the builder configuration in here. Let's give it a more proper name in here. Okay. So now that we have the factory builder set up in here, we can start injecting those clients. So now that we have the NuGet packages installed, we can use the factory builder to add a search client. In this case, we would like to use the indexer client, which is going to provide us the capability to create a data source, which is going to be the first step. So what we need to provide as part of this extension method, it will be to include the URL of the services that we are using. So remember that we always work with the Azure directory. So if you take a sneak peek into the updated configuration into the PowerShell, I included a couple of scripts in order to add role assignments for your account and also for the managed identity for the Azure service that we created on the last video. So here we only need to operationalize everything. Once more, we will be using the builder configuration, and in this case we will be getting a required section. And the required section, we are going to be calling it search service. So this section is going to contain all the information that is required for the authentication, and we will take a look in a moment into that. As always, we will be providing a name, and in this case the name is going to be the search service indexer. And also remember to set up the credential, in this case using once more the with credential, and let's use the new default Azure credential as always. So with this, we have the basic configuration to use the indexer client. So let's take a look into the code in order to create a successful data storage. Now the next step that we need to complete is to provide the additional settings into the app settings. So make sure to update your app settings in order to add a new configuration section, which is called the search service. Under this one, make sure to add an additional configuration, which is the endpoint, and in this one specify the URL of your search service. The URL is going to be exactly the same one, just make sure to replace the initial part, which is need to match with the name of the service that you choose to. Providing this configuration in here as the app settings that we have, it is going to inject this client successful. So this is the structure the service is actually waiting. A section with an endpoint configuration, and that should be everything. With this kind of configuration and also with the Azure default credential, the library and the factory itself already knows that we are going to be using Azure Active Directory to authenticate against this service. Remember that we are trying not to use any keys or anything like that. So now that we have everything configured, let's take a look into the code that is required in order to build the data factory successfully. So as part of the implementation, I already created a small boilerplate that is actually using the media TR and the mediator pattern to use of the code. This is a very boilerplate code, so if you are not familiar with the media TR or the mediator pattern, I strongly suggest you to keep up to date with that, because as a .NET developer, for sure you can take a huge advantage of not only of this library, but also of that pattern. I'm going to skip that for now, and I suggest you to take a look into the YouTube channels, where you will be able to find a lot of information about the mediator pattern. Okay, so what we have in here is just the request, the response that we would like to provide as part of the service, the command that we are going to be executing, and the most important part, it will be the handler, which is going to provide everything. I also already prepared the endpoint that is going to expose the creation of the data storage pretty easily. So now let's implement the code together. So the first thing that we need to have, it will be of course the Azure Client Factory with the type search index client injected into our class. So we will be able to create a new instance of the search client. So the first line of code that we need to provide, it will be that part. So let's create a search indexer client using the search client that we just injected into the factory in here, and use the name search service indexer. Remember, this name must match the one that you created here in the program.ss in order to make sure that we are injecting the right client. Now that we have the right client, the next thing we need to do is to create a search indexer data source connection as part of the input. So for that, it's actually pretty simple. Let's use the data source connection definition in order to create a new search indexer data connection, and all these classes are already part of everything that is included in the NuGet package. So what we need to provide as part of the request is actually pretty simple. We need to provide the name of the data storage. This is fully custom. You can provide whatever name you would like to give to the data storage. Also, we need to provide a type. In this case, remember that we mentioned that we could have blob storage, Azure SQL, or Cosmos DB, and several other types. But in this case, we are going to be working the blob storage. We also need to provide the storage ID as part of the input. We are going to take a look how the storage ID needs to be formatted in order to work properly. And also we need to provide a container name, which is actually where in the storage account our data is going to be stored. So let's take a look very quickly into the browser. If you remember, from the storage account, you could have as many containers as you would like to have. This is the storage account that I will be using for this demo, and as you can see, I have two containers, the default for logs and also another one that is the data container. This is the one that I will be using for the demo, and as you can see already, I have a couple of files which are going to be used by the search indexer. We will go that later, but this is the container name. So for that particular column that I'm speaking to, make sure that you provide as part of the container name, the one that you are going to be using must match the name of the container on the Azure portal. So with that in hand, we can make the data source connection request using that information. For the last parameter, remember the container name. It has to be successfully also created with the search indexer data container instance. This is going to specify to the factory client in this case that we are going to be using that kind of connection using the blob storage throughout a container. Now that we have everything on the data connection source, all we need to do is to grab and do the request throughout the search client. So let's grab the response pretty quickly in here. And we are going to be doing in here is using the same client from here. The operation that we are going to be using, it will be the create or update a data source connection async, and the parameter this one is going to take will be the data source connection that we just specified previously, and also the cancellation token as part of the input. Nothing too overcomplicated. So as part of the handler, we also are saying that we are going to be returning a data source response, and this is actually going to be very simple. Once the operation has been completed, we are going to be grabbing from the response the name of the data storage that has been created on the Azure side, and also the type, just to make it pretty simple. So let's return a new instance of that class, and let's provide as part of the response.value.name and also the response.value.type to a string. The type is an enum, so make sure to use the toString so we can set it throughout the JSON file. Okay, so as you can see, creating a Our data source is actually pretty easily. So let's execute the endpoint and see the result. Okay, now that we are running the API, let's take a look into the browser. Now we have the API up and running and we have the endpoint exposing here. So let's take a look as an example from the JSON request. For the data storage name, I'm going to be using this random name that I have been using for the Cloud World Lab storage in here. The data source type is going to be the Azure blob, and the storage ID is actually one of the most important pieces. For this particular parameter, make sure that you provide the resource ID equal and provide the resource ID of your resource. Remember, the parameter after the subscription is going to be your subscription ID, then provide the resource group and also the name of the resource group they provided and also the type of resource, which is in this case a storage account, and the name of the storage account. Making the request that way is going to specify the data factory that we are going to be using the managed identity in order to connect to the storage account. So if you take a sneak peek also into the PowerShell that gives all the permissions, you will notice that I also included a line of code throughout the CLI, which is going to give the identity what we enable in the search service, the actions to be able to interact with the blob storage as an owner. And the container name is going to be data, as I explained previously, matching the container on the Azure side. So let's go back into the search service, let's make a look into the data sources, and let's send this request. Okay, so we already got a response in here. We got the data storage response and also the Azure blob. So if I go back into the Azure portal, I will be able to see my data storage in here already set up. Something pretty simple. So as you can see, we have the storage name, the blob container that we are going to be using, and also we are specifying already that we are going to be using a managed identity in order to interact with the service in this case, which is the blob storage. So as you can see, building a data source from the data storage like a blob storage and a storage account is actually pretty simple.